Okay, so welcome to the paper, everything you need to know about paper workshop. And hopefully I can give you everything you need to know. There's a lot. So with all my workshops, I've said it's an hour. It's more than likely going to go over an hour. I have no problem if you need to leave at any point. There will be a recording, and I will send the recording out to everyone. And also it will be on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, which is the Calligraphy Joburg channel, and it's going to be on there pretty much forever, and it's a public video. So you can go in there and you'll be able to find it anytime. So what I'm going to start off with is a little bit about the terminology. So I like paper. I think most of us quite like paper, but it starts to get a little bit, you know, when you've got all these terms, and I've got 5 pages of notes that I made for myself. So which is ridiculous. I thought this would be an easy workshop because I, thought I knew everything, being a calligraphy teacher. Turns out, not so much. So I'm going to start off with just basic terminology. And when I say basic, things that pertain to what I teach and what most of you would be doing. So obviously, when I started researching, a lot of information came up about printing in terms of the printing industry. So packaging, magazines, that kind of thing. So first of all, I had to sift out what I needed, and it got pretty complicated. So I've tried to keep it nice and simple, and I also don't want to get too technical. So obviously, if there's something specific that you're interested in, you can go and research that further. But what I'm going to do is start off with a little bit of terminology, just the basics. If you have questions, please, at any point, you're welcome to stop and, to ask me a question. And what I'm going to then do, I've got all my paper, I've got piles of paper around me, and I'm going to go through things like what is Bristol paper, different brands, different kinds of marker paper, what is marker paper, also things like tracing paper, craft paper, papers that you can use, and also what you can't use. So it's quite important to know what you shouldn't use for your brush markers. If you're just working with a normal ballpoint pen, it doesn't really matter, but things like brush markers, fountain pens, those are all, it gets tricky when you're working with the wrong papers. Okay. So starting off with just some basic terminology regarding markers. A lot of people will ask me, they'll see alcohol marker or alcohol-based marker and a water-based marker. And, what is that? And can I use an alcohol-based marker for brush lettering? So I've got 2 markers here that are the same brand. This is a Tombow one. So if you're doing brush lettering, often you would know the Tombow. If you don't know Tombow specifically, it's very similar to the Koi markers. It's got the big nib on the end. Okay, compared to a small brush pen, for example, like that. Okay, so a big brush pen has quite a delicate nib. So I'll get into that just now. But basically, with the markers, the difference is what's in the ink. So a water-based marker has a water solution, which means you can blend it using water or a blending pen that has the same ink. And then an alcohol-based marker is, this one has a gray body. So they're both Tombow, but this one has a gray, like a very light gray body, and it says on it alcohol-based. So what that means is it's a more permanent ink, and you would use it for, you can write on surfaces like glass and ceramics, that kind of thing, but also, and I didn't know this because I don't do coloring with my markers, but I found out also some new things in this research. I'm very excited about this workshop. But apparently when you're coloring, obviously you need to work on the right paper, but when you're coloring with an alcohol-based marker, you get less streaking and your blends are better. So, for someone like me who's only teaching writing, that's not relevant. But if you're doing a lot of coloring and you're doing art and using markers, then something like that is important. And if you're wanting to know which are alcohol, you just think of Copic, those Copic markers, they're quite expensive, the chameleon markers, and they will always say alcohol based on them. And often you will get, what do they call, a chisel tip like this. So you'll have a chisel end. So if you look at this, it's got the brush end on that end. So that's a flexible brush point. So you can use it like a brush, or you can write with it. And then you've got the chisel marker. So that would give you stripes. The equivalent marker, the Tombow one in the water-based one, has a very fine hard end. So it's got the little bullet end. It's like what we would use for, if you think of kids markers or kids cookies. So a hard end on that one, and on the alcohol-based, a chisel tip. And that's often how an alcohol-based marker is. It's got a chisel tip at one end, sometimes a brush point, sometimes a bullet end. The problem with alcohol markers is they bleed right through paper. So people will say to me, oh, I already have some alcohol markers. Can I use that for brush lettering? So if you already have them, sure, no problem. You can practice with them, but they're going to bleed through. They'll go right through. You can literally see on both sides whatever you've written. So if you don't own them already, I would suggest not buying them for writing because they are quite, it's quite a strong ink. And I have yet to discover how to get the alcohol out of the alcohol ink. I'm just kidding. So during lockdown, I think we were all like, will it work? No. You can smell it, by the way. They have a very specific smell. If you think of Sharpies and a lot of those, like the black, those like what you'd write on a box, you know, if you're moving house and you've got a black Cokie, those are all alcohol based. Okay, then moving on just for a couple of terms, I just want to explain these because it'll be helpful during the session. So when you see the word tooth, I think of teeth that we eat with, but on paper has a tooth. So you'll sometimes see, and I have it on one of these watercolor papers. So it will say on here, this is a 180 gram, and it says on here, medium tooth. And on this one, which is a 300 gram, oh, wrong one, sorry guys. Where's my, this is a 300 gram and it says rough tooth. So what that means is how rough your paper is. So it kind of makes sense if you think of the paper almost has little teeth, and on a watercolor paper, a rough tooth is going to give you a slightly more textured, if I feel it, you can feel the, it's not sharp, it's just got a much more textured surface. So if you're working with something like watercolors, and I'll touch briefly on watercolor paper, I'm not going to do too much about watercolor paper because Elaine and I are going to do a free watercolor lesson as well, which discusses all watercolor things. So we'll go into the paper more in more detail there. But just briefly, with watercolor paper, the tooth will give you more of a texture and it'll hold more paper and more color. However, if you're working with a brush marker, you don't want that. You're wanting a smooth surface. So you're wanting a very fine tooth. So if you think of that, fine tooth versus medium versus heavy, it kind of makes sense. So often you'll pick up a pad of paper, now you're standing at Herbert Evans or wherever, and you're reading all these things. I think, well, I don't know what that means. And I hear you. So that is tooth. And then the next thing that you will often hear about is coated versus uncoated paper. So if I keep looking down, guys, because I'm referring to my very extensive notes, I'm going to try not to read, but I also don't want to miss anything out here. So coated versus uncoated paper basically means a coated paper will be sealed and an uncoated paper would not be sealed. So you might think, well, why would you need that? So if you think of, for instance, magazine, you look at a glossy magazine page, that is a coating on the surface. It's quite a heavy coating, quite a shiny coating. Then you look at marker paper, which I'll show you just now, that also has a coating, and that's to make it bleed proof. Bristol paper, for instance, is not coated. So I'll discuss Bristol paper more in detail now, but there are certain papers that are coated that will work for brush lettering, others don't. So Bristol paper works very well for brush lettering, but it is uncoated. Whereas if you look at something like printer paper or cheap, like newspaper, for instance, it will just soak your ink in. So an uncoated paper will have a higher absorbency rate than coated paper. And the coating, because I've always joked about, I have no idea what they're coated with. Oh, I now know. So it says, and I got this from a couple of sources, typically a clay or a polymer or a mixture of different materials. So it's something very light that they're putting on. It's not like you can really see it. You know, you think of clay, you think of this heavy surface. It's obviously a very light mixture. And what that does, for instance, with bleed proof paper, it seals your paper and it actually stops your ink going through the paper. What's nice about that is it keeps your ink on top and it keeps it nice and vibrant. Whereas obviously if it soaks in, you're going to have a duller look to your colors. Okay, then hot pressed versus cold pressed. So if you are doing watercolor, you would probably have come across that quite often. With brush lettering and watercolor, it's the opposite. So if you are working with watercolors, you're wanting to have preferably a cold pressed surface because it's got more of a ripple effect and it'll hold more ink. It also doesn't show your mistakes as easily. If you're doing watercolor and you are wanting very fine details, if you're doing those botanical drawings, you're doing very tiny detail with your brush, a hot press paper is good because it's very smooth. But if you're just doing sort of normal watercolor, like the kind of watercolor that we do in our classes, and if you follow Elaine on, she's my friend who teaches with me, if you follow her on Facebook, you'll often see she does the most beautiful, beautiful detailed pictures, but they're quite big. So it's not like these teeny little miniatures. So for her, she would prefer a cold press where there's more of a ripple effect, mainly because it's just nicer to work on, and it doesn't, it holds more color. If you're doing brush lettering, it's completely the opposite. What you don't want is a rough surface. So you're wanting to have a smooth surface so that your pen glides across the surface. You're looking at a nib like this. That is quite a big nib. There's my finger by comparison. That's a big nib. So it's made up out of fibers. For those of you that don't know brush pens, it's a whole lot of fibers, just like a normal fiber tipped marker, but they're flexible. So they move continuously like this. So if you're working across rough paper, you're actually fraying your fibers, and you end up with your brush pen being kind of fuzzy at the end. Obviously, the more expensive the brush pen, the longer that takes, but then also the more expensive it is when you've damaged your pen. So for brush lettering, you preferably want a hot press surface. So hot pressed, effectively what that means is they're using hot rollers, heated rollers, so that smooths out the paper instead of a cold roller. So sometimes you will see CP or NOT. So CP will be cold pressed. NOT, I thought it stood for something like N and O and a T. Apparently it's just the word not in capital letters. Apparently in the UK, they will have not quite often on the paper and in capitals, and it means not hot pressed. So HP is for hot pressed and CP is for cold pressed. So cold press paper is more absorbent. So going back to the brush lettering, you're wanting less absorbent. So hot press is better. And if you've used Bristol paper, which is hot press, or marker paper, you'll know what I mean. Your pens glide and your colors sit nicely on the top. Then, okay, the other reason why, and this makes sense, I didn't realize it until I was reading about it, it actually makes sense. If you think of hot press paper, and I'm talking about Bristol, so I've got some samples that I made here. This is the Canson. All my samples look the same. So I spent the last few days making samples, testing the papers. So if you look at a smooth surface, this is Canson Bristol, which I'll show you properly just now. But it's a very, very smooth surface. And when you're blending, when you're working on it, you want your colors to sit, but you also want your colors to be vibrant. This paper is so smooth and so white that what it actually does is it reflects light back off the paper. So if you think of a cold press paper that's rough, your light is absorbed more. Hot press it's like a marble floor or a marble surface. It's going to reflect your light back up at you. And what it also does is it reflects your light through your ink. So if you've got a word written on there, you actually have the benefit of the brightness and the flatness of the paper reflecting your light back up at you. So that's another reason why the very smooth paper is better for brush lettering. Okay, then, and guys, please, any questions you have along the way, if you think of something, you're welcome to stop and ask me. Okay, as
Robyn?
Yes.
I just want to ask, does the tooth of the paper have anything to do with the weight? Are they related or not?
So, no, I'm going to get to weight now. Weight's quite an interesting thing. The tooth has nothing to do with it. The tooth is simply how rough your paper is on top. So the weight of the paper is worked out in a different way. The tooth of the paper is how rough your paper is. So you can have a very toothy paper and a very smooth paper, and they can be the same weight. So, but I'll explain to you now, because also that's the other confusing thing is you see a pad of paper and it's got this gram thing on it. You don't know what that is. So I'm going to explain that. I'm going to do acid-free, a couple of other things, and then I'm doing weight of paper. So it's in here, don't worry. Okay. So acid-free is the next thing I'm going to move on to. And often you will see that on pads. And I know when you're doing scrapbooking and that kind of thing, acid-free is quite important. I know with photography, obviously I'm not discussing photographic paper, but in photography, acid-free is quite important. Basically, acid is bad. Acid causes yellowing. An acid-free paper means without acid, okay? So a high acidity paper will degrade quickly. Acid-free paper is commonly used for fine art prints and limited edition printing, as well as permanent record. I'm reading here. Permanent records where contact with paper acidity could harm the documents. I'm going to get to archival in a moment because there's acid-free and then there's archival. And I had no clue. I mean, you just see these words and they sound great. Acid-free sounds good. Anything free. We live in a society where this free and that free is good, and normally it costs more. So acid-free always sounded good. Turns out I was right. An acid-free paper is usually made, well, not usually, it is made using alkaline paper making technology. So the idea is to keep your paper's neutrality above 7. So 7 is neutral, and then anything higher is going into the alkaline side. So acid-free means it's 7 or above. pH neutral paper means it's at 7. So I've got some pads here where it actually says pH neutral on there. What it means is it's acid free, but it's set at 7. It's not varying above. The acid free paper is also buffered with an alkaline reserve, such as calcium carbonate. And what that does is it neutralizes your acid compounds, neutralizes the acid compounds absorbed from the atmosphere or formed through natural aging. Okay. If you want to know more about that, I found all of this information very easily on Google, but basically what you need to know is if it says acid-free and or pH neutral, it's going to be good. It'll last longer and won't go as yellow as if you think of newsprint, for instance. Okay, then archival. So archival is taking your acid-free paper and going a level up. So basically, archival paper by default will be acid-free. And the reason you would use archival paper is where you've got, so archival paper is meant to be used for publications of high legal, historical, and significant value. So if you think of something that needs to last for 100 years, several hundred years, thousands of years, obviously archival is going to be better. So there are also no universal standards for archival paper. So there are various things that it needs to not have, but it's not, it's, you know, you can kind of vary within those parameters. So obviously it's acid free, but also it needs to contain no groundwood or unbleached pulp. It needs to meet strict limits on metallic content, and it needs to be free from optical brighteners, which artificially make the sheet whiter. So it's all of those things that will take your normal acid-free paper and then they process it a bit more. The other difference is that with archival paper, often they will use cotton rag. So cotton rag is when you've taken cotton fibers and you've used that instead of wood. So if it's cotton rag paper, it's made without wood-based pulp. It's a cotton-based pulp. So with archival paper, you can break it down into 2 categories. There's the conservation grade, which is acid-free buffered paper made from wood-based pulp. Then there's archival grade. So it's archival paper, which is archival grade or museum grade. And that is like the best you can get. And that is 100% cotton rag paper made from cotton pulp. So no wood at all. And obviously it's acid-free and it conforms with all those other properties. If you're looking for the ultimate in permanence, you're wanting your document, now you've written a letter to your husband, you want to last for 1,000,000 years, and go with 100% cotton rag paper. Even banknotes are often made with 75 to 100%. So even those, which when you think of a banknote, it's pretty, you know, they last pretty well. Even a mangled up manky 10 Rand note, it's fairly sturdy, and it's made with somewhere between 75 and 100% cotton rag. So it's not essential. It's just, I like to know all these things. You see all these terms floating around, and it's quite nice to know what they mean. So even though you may have the absolute best paper, there are still other things that you need to consider. So environmental factors are quite important. If you are getting the best paper you can get, and you've got the best pens and everything's great, but you don't look after your paper properly, you're going to have a problem. So things like, and I'm just going to quickly read through them. Obviously, it's all the normal ones: light, heat, humidity, those kinds of things. Sunlight and ultraviolet light can cause fading and brittleness. Too low a humidity will cause paper brittleness, and too high a humidity would cause a chance of mold. So that kind of makes sense. The lower the storage temperature of paper, the longer it lasts. So the life of paper is doubled with every decrease of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. What really damages paper is cycling, where you've got a major sort of cycle through from very hot to very cold, or you've got these humidity fluctuations. So that is actually worse than very hot all the time or very cold all the time. It's this continuous fluctuation. And the reason for that is it actually weakens and breaks down your paper, because what it does is it causes the fibers to continuously expand, contract, expand. So that also makes sense. So, you know, if it's something that you don't really mind too much, you know, then it's okay. But if it's papers or documents or letters or something that you want to keep for quite a long time, or they're really sentimental to you, just watch out for those factors. Okay, then the next thing I'm going to chat about quickly is brightness. So that might sound a bit weird, but if you're looking on all of these papers, and I've got them all stacked up here to show you, it will often say ultra bright. I've got ultra bright, super bright. There's a whole bunch. Every paper manufacturer will try and come up with something different, but basically bright is good. The brighter, the better. Your brightness is measured on a scale of 0 to 100. So a lot of the papers are sort of 95 to 100, those very, very white ones. And a 95 bright paper will be brighter and whiter and will reflect more light than an 85 bright, for instance. So I've actually got some HP paper. Sorry, the pack, this is a plastic pack, and it arrived. I've taken some paper out, so it's a bit squishy. Arrived a bit damaged as well. This is premium HP premium 32, which I'll talk about just now, and it says on here 100 brightness. This is literally the brightest paper that you can get. You might think, oh, white paper is white paper. When you start putting them all out next to each other, some of them that you might have thought were fairly white actually look less white, not yellow, just less bright than other papers. So brightness is quite a thing. And a lot of times, you know, that's like a selling point. So it'd be like, oh, this bright white paper. And if you think of what I said about the light reflecting, it makes sense. If you're doing photocopies and you're wanting quite a good quality, high quality paper for copying, that type of paper is quite good because it's very, very smooth and very reflective. So your ink will sit nicely on it. Then lightfastness is another thing. So lightfastness is a property and of paper, and what it is the ability of paper to or color. So it also applies to pens. The ability of paper or color to resist fading or yellowing when exposed to light. So it's more permanent in the light. So no paper can be 100% light fast. So obviously, you know, there will be some fading. But with paper, I'm just going to read this because it's a bit complicated. So, I mean, for me to remember. So various chemical constituents in paper pulp reduce its light fastness, in particular the presence of lignin. So lignin, it's Lignin. It's a naturally occurring chemical found in wood that binds fibers of cellulose together. So it's part of the wood. So when you take a tree and you're making it into paper, lignin is there. It's not something that has to be added. You need to try and take that out for making your paper more light fast. So the goal of many pulping systems, so all these paper manufacturers in their pulping systems, their goal is to try and remove as much lignin as possible from the wood pulp. So the lignin is actually what is responsible for your paper yellowing or darkening. And if you look at newsprint, for instance, I mean, that's quite a cheapy paper. It often will go yellow, and it's always amazing how a white paper can go yellow, and it's the lignin. So various chemical pulping procedures and the use of bleaching agents will remove nearly all the lignin from the wood pulp. But ground wood pulp still contains a high amount of lignin. So ground wood pulp. So when I explained about archival paper, there needs to be no ground wood pulp in there, and it's because of the lignin. So newsprint, it's cheap. They don't worry too much about that. And where it's, you know, something that's a cheap paper and they're not worrying about it, the longevity, it's fine. And that's also why often the more expensive, the better quality papers will be more expensive because of all these processes. Then the next word, and this is one that I continuously forget what the meaning is, the word opaque. And I could never remember, does it mean it's see-through or does it mean it's solid? So opacity, which is the opaqueness, the opacity refers to how solid the paper is. So if you think of cardboard, so opaque, 100% opaque is completely solid. And then if you think of like a thick cardboard, it's completely opaque, and like a very thick cardboard. And then tracing paper would be a lot less opaque. So your opaque level goes down. So tracing paper, also a very weird product. So I'm going to touch on that just now. Then, because if you look at tracing paper, it almost feels plastic. It's got a very weird feeling, but it is actually paper, normal paper. Okay, then matte paper. So matte means it has a semi-gloss finish. It's not that shiny paper. So matte paper produces no glare and it's resistant to smudging and imprints left by fingerprints. A lot of times that high gloss paper, you think of magazines, of very expensive magazines, you touch them and you've got fingerprints on there. A lot of the pads that I have, especially the black ones, like the tracing paper, the Croxy one, the black pad, oh my gosh, as you touch, it's shiny. As you touch it, it leaves the fingerprints. I always pick up the pad underneath, especially ones I'm selling, and try not to touch the outside because you get a fingerprint on it. You actually can't get it off. You try and rub it off with a cloth or something, and it's just the natural oils in your skin. So matte paper doesn't do that. Then paper weight. Okay, so paper weight is something that once I explain, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it's quite a confusing thing when you see a gram size, or like this says 205 G, or it will say 205 GSM. So the way that you measure the weight of paper, so we work in grams in South Africa, and in America they're working in pounds. So grams, you're working on grams per square meter. So if I took this, these are my notes printed on normal printer paper, and I took a square meter of this. So I went and I took this and I took off a big roll and I cut 1 square meter. And then I took a square meter of, this is 300 gram. Printer paper is about 80 gram, by the way. This is watercolor paper. It's a sheet of watercolor paper I've got. You can see it's much thicker. This is a 300 gram. So if I measure a square meter of this paper and a square, or weigh a square meter of this and a square meter of this, this one is going to weigh 80 grams for that square meter, and this one will weigh 300 grams. Other papers will weigh whatever it says on the front. So Bristol, for instance, there's various different weights. The Bristol Canson Bristol, this one, and I've only got a really big pad. Sorry guys, the A3. This one will say 180 grams on it, and my Tombow one will say 250 grams. They're both Bristol. So it gets super confusing because then you think, but I thought Bristol was this weight, but actually here's one that's that weight. The weight of the paper is simply how thick the paper is and how heavy the paper is. It doesn't refer to the roughness. This is a watercolor paper, a cold press one. It's got quite a nice roughness to it. Bristol paper is completely smooth. It is purely based on the weight of the paper. Some papers are quite dense, so they'll actually say on there that the paper is, when you buy it, it'll say very dense, which means that you might think, okay, it's 100 gram or 120, but it's actually the equivalent of a higher gram weight in another paper brand because of the very dense method of making it. When you are looking at the weight of paper, people often think that that means it's going to be a good paper. It doesn't have anything to do with that. All it's telling you is that it's a paper or it's a cardstock or whatever it is. So if you look at, where's my notes here on there? Okay, cardstock. So paper is anything from very light. I don't know what the sort of lightest you can get. I've got paper that's about 46 grams. It's quite thin. So very light, very low gram weight, right up to about 135. From 135 to about 300, it becomes cardstock. It's known as cardstock. So paper, cardstock, and then you get cardboard or paper board. So paper board is much thicker. So paper board will typically be heavier than 220. So you'll often hear people talking about cardstock. And what is cardstock, and what, we grew up with cardboard, and cardstock is from about 135 grams. So if you look at paper that is 135 grams, I have, this is Bristol, it's 180 grams. That's a cardstock, but to me, it's a little bit flimsy to be a cardboard. Cardboard, you're thinking of more like a thicker board. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but basically what you're wanting is, if it is a Bristol paper and you're wanting to make a card, like an actual birthday card, and you go and buy that yellow pad I showed you now, and it says 180 grams, and you fold your card up, it's going to kind of sag like that because it is not really that thick. When I do card making workshops, I will always work with 250 grams up because if you fold it, it'll stand nicely on its own. If you're wanting to use a thinner card or a thinner paper and do your blending or do your picture, whatever it is, you can always take that and mount it onto an actual card. So you could glue it on or use mounting tape, and you can stick it onto a heavier card. But sometimes you'll make a card and it kind of sags, and you think, okay, I don't know why, and it's because your paper's not heavy enough. Just on paper, when you're looking at folding paper, so this goes for obviously if you're making cards, even if you're making little place cards, little tiny ones, what they call it, a tent fold one, where it goes up like that and you've got your name on, or you're doing bookbinding. So I teach bookbinding workshops, and this is quite important. When you're folding paper, paper has a grain. So all paper has a grain, and you will know that if you've ever torn paper and you tear from the top and you take your paper, I'm not going to tear my notes because I have nothing to read. If I took this and I tore down, or I tore this way, one direction is going to tear nice and straight into long strips. The other is literally going to tear across the page like that. I'm sure you've seen that. You tear something up and you think, gosh, it kind of just goes like a jagged line across. It's because you're working against the grain. So paper will fold more readily if you're folding with the grain than against the grain. So now you'll think, how am I supposed to know that? I've got this paper and I don't know, if I fold it, now I'm making place cards and we're having a function and I want to make little place cards. When you cut the paper, it's kind of square. Now you've got to fold it one way or the other. How do you know which direction to fold? So easy way to tell. You take your sheet of paper. This is the 300-gram watercolor paper. I'm going to use that because it's a nice thickness and it really will show, it'll demo this very nicely. If I fold this paper, I'm pushing with my hands. You can see here, there's resistance. Obviously, you can't feel what I'm feeling, but you can see that I've got resistance there. That paper is saying, I'm going nowhere. If you fold it this way, it's even worse. So now you think, okay, but then actually that, and let's remember it's a 300-gram, so that is actually better than this. Here, it really is going nowhere. So if you're going to fold paper like this, which is the 80-gram paper, and you want to fold it in half, I can feel that there's a little bit of resistance there. If I do it this way, almost no resistance. That paper literally folds itself. I could just squish it now and it'd be fine. So usually with this kind of paper, we're wanting to fold it in half. That's sometimes why you'll see your paper has a bit of a mouth. It opens up like that. If you're doing watercolor paper and you're folding it, and the best way to fold, if you're wanting to fold it in half, and it's thick, even though this is actually the best direction, take a scorer, a bone folder, or one of those bamboo folders, and a ruler, and you put that down and you score a couple of times along the side, or along, on the top next to the ruler. You score it, and then when you fold it, it'll fold more easily because you're actually just making an indentation and you're allowing those papers to fold more easily. If you take a thick piece like this and you just fold it in half and you squash it, you're going to have a lot of breaks and cracks along the side. So rather score it, but always test that. So even though, like I said earlier, that looks as if the paper's saying, I'm not folding, it's actually better than that. And that makes a huge difference. If you've done place cards and they're all going like that, they're all sitting on the table flat like that, it's because they folded in the opposite, in the wrong direction for themselves, for their fibers. Okay. So one last thing on the paper is the word decor edge. So there's a shop in Cape Town called the Decor Edge, and you might think, what does it mean? Decor edge, if you've got a sheet of handmade paper, so this is not handmade paper, you can see it as a very sharp edge. If you take a sheet of handmade paper, it often has a very pretty edge. It looks as if it's been torn, but you can see it's not been torn. It's actually formed when the paper was made. In the paper making process, you have a mold. The frame is called the decal, and no, the frame. I think that the mesh part, I can't remember. One of them is a decal, one's the frame. But when you scoop your frame through and you bring it up, and then you take that edge off, and your wet paper pulp is sitting on the top of the mesh. As that paper pulp sits there and dries, the edge of it has a beautiful deckled edge. It's not a cut edge. So that's what that means. Handmade paper, I'm not even going to go into that. That is quite difficult to write on. If you're buying professionally made handmade paper, it often will be, you'll be able to write it. If you do paper, like I've made paper, and you try and write on it, and the ink goes, really, really difficult to work with. You can size it, you can put gesso on, there's a whole lot of different things you can, I'm not going to go into that now, but handmade paper, if you're buying it and it's purely decorative, that's great. If you're planning to write on it, you need to be very, very careful, or use a ballpoint pen and you'll be fine. Okay, so now I'm just going to chat briefly about ink issues. So often with ink, you will hear these phrases, feathering, bleeding, ghosting. You think, what on earth? Okay, feathering is where you write and your ink, so you've got a line of ink and the ink just slightly feathers on the edges. Okay, so it gets that as if you've wet it slightly. So often what will happen is it's the paper is wrong. So say you took your fountain pen and you wrote on normal printer paper. Printer paper is very absorbent. It's not coated. It's quite, the fibers are quite absorbent. It'll just soak that ink in and it kind of just, because it is actually wet. You've wet the paper and it's feathering. If you have the wrong paper, that is often the main culprit. However, if you're working with very juicy, wet inks, and I know it sounds weird, not all ink is the same. Some ink is more wet and juicy than other inks. If you are working with a nib that is quite big, so I have, and I don't have them here, I have a Pilot Parallel, which is a wide pen, and those are the ones I use to teach Gothic. When you're working with a Pilot Parallel pen that is 6 millimeters wide, just think about that for a moment, 6 millimeters wide, and it's made up with 2 flat metal pieces, and the ink flows through the middle. That is a lot of ink coming through. Those Pilot Parallels bleed on everything. They are terrible. They don't bleed so much on, when I say bleed, they literally, they feather, but they also go straight through your page. If you're working on a bleed-proof paper, they're much better. But that is an example of a pen just inking everywhere. So it's not necessarily there in your paper. It'll do that on quite good quality paper as well, but it's because there's a lot of ink. But a lot of the time, it is your paper quality that's not great. It's more often than that than not the paper. Just one thing, when we had, I'm talking about Joburg here, when we had those it was nearly 3 weeks of insane rain. It rained every single day. I took my my pen, and my personal pen, which I use for writing in a bullet journal, same book I've always written in, same pen I've always written in. And I have an extra fine nib. It's the smallest one you can get. Tiny little nib. And Lamy pen, Lamy ink. I know the pen, I mean, these are the ones I sell. And then I took the pen and I wrote, and it just feathered. And it was the 3 weeks of rain that had actually caused the paper. And this is a paper in a book. It wasn't like it was sitting out on a patio or something. It was just that dampness in the air. I'm sure you remember that. It was about, when was it, a couple of weeks ago, we had that crazy rain. So sometimes the environmental factors will affect that, because I couldn't believe it. I wrote and it just feathered. And then, you know, the next time I wrote, it was fine. You know, once the air dried out. So the other thing that can cause feathering is if you have oils in your hands. We all have natural oils in our skin. Some people a little bit more than others. And when you're working on paper, as you're writing, where your hand is touching, often what will happen is when you get down towards the bottom of the page, suddenly your pen's not behaving quite the same. And it can sometimes be from that. Also, if you're wearing hand cream, that can make a difference. I'm quite particular about hand cream. I'm always doing it on the back. I try not to get on the front. I don't like the feeling, but I also know from working with papers, it's a nightmare. What you can do is just put another piece of paper underneath your hand and you just write with that. Sometimes some people have quite sweaty hands, and that can also make your paper crinkle a bit, and it makes it a bit damp. So then just use a protective sheet underneath. So that is feathering. Bleeding is when your ink literally soaks through to the other side. And bleeding is, if you turn your page over, you'll see the ink has come right through. So that's what I was talking about, these alcohol markers, they will bleed right through. They're not designed for normal paper. So sometimes you'll write with a pen, like my small Pentel pens, the small brush pens. I've got the small Tombow ones, and then the small Pentel ones are very inky. So what makes them nice is that they're so vibrant and so, the colors are so bright. But when you write on, like in an ordinary bullet journal, it tends to bleed right through, whereas these ones, the color versions, won't do that. And it's just the amount of juicy ink that they can't help themselves. They want to put all the ink on the paper, and they're such amazing pens to write with, but not on like on normal paper, even quite a heavy weight paper. So with bullet journal, you'll quite often get quite thick weighted paper, but if it's not bleed-proof paper, which it generally wouldn't be in a bullet journal, that ink is still going to go through. So always have a test page. If you're working in a journal and you're not sure, a lot of the bullet journal people that I know will have an ink section, like a swatch section at the back, and then they'll get new pens and they'll test them out in the back of the journal, and you're checking out what the colors look like and whether they bleed or feather or ghost. So ghosting is the last one we're going to talk about. If you have ghosting, ghosting is literally where you turn your page over and you can lightly see the writing coming through. It hasn't bled through. It's more like just almost like a shadow of what's on the other side of the page. For some people, they quite like that. Other people, it drives them insane. You then either need to change your pen or you need to work with a heavier weight of paper. So I know from teaching kids where I do handwriting coaching, we'll work in normal school books, and a lot of the kids will work with ballpoint pens. When you give one of those kids a pen like this is a Pilot, normal Pilot pen, just an ordinary gel pen. This pen will ghost and sometimes bleed. If you write quite slowly and heavily, it'll actually bleed right through the paper, whereas a ballpoint pen won't. And I know a lot of the schools have said no gel pens, we're not allowing them. I just think, why? That's so ridiculous, because gel pens write so nicely. And it actually is because they will go through the paper. And with school, you're working on both sides of your paper. So a ballpoint pen is not going to do that. Ironically, these are the Pilots that do that. The Pentel version, it looks very similar. That one doesn't do that. So if you are looking at nice pens for your kids, don't buy the Pilots, get the Pentel ones, because the ink is not quite as inky. They're beautiful to write with, but it's just the ink that's the quality is. These go right through. Okay, then tracing paper. Oh, and with ghosting, there's not much you can do about it except change your paper. With bleeding, just one thing, if you're practicing, and like when I'm teaching Gothic classes and you're wanting to practice, those big thick Pilot parallel pens are really nice to work with. What I'll tell people is use a backing sheet. So you're going to bleed through and you're going to have the everything showing on your next page. So you use this underneath. Turn your page and you'll protect the one underneath. So if you're just practicing and it's quite an inky pen, but you want to use it, just use a backing sheet. Okay, then tracing paper, just to briefly touch on that. Tracing paper, and the reason I'm talking about it is because tracing paper is actually very nice to practice with. If you are doing, gosh, let me find my sample here. If you're doing brush lettering and you're wanting to practice your brush lettering, tracing paper actually works pretty well. So if you look at tracing paper, obviously it's quite thin. You can, and that's 2 sheets. You can see right through it. You can even see, you all know how tracing paper works. You can see my notes right through there. So when you're practicing brush lettering, and you just want to, say you print out a set of practice sheets with the alphabet on, you can use your tracing paper and you don't have to keep printing those practice sheets. You can just trace over and, here we go. I made samples of all different kinds of paper. Tracing paper is actually one of the samples that you can see me right through that. So if I just put this onto the pad here, I have tested various different things. So I've tested writing with the small nib tombow. I've tested with the big, one of the big tombos, which is very similar to the koi pens. And I've tested blending. Guys, you can blend on tracing paper. It works amazingly well. So if you're wanting to practice your blending, you can practice on tracing paper. You're going to get a slightly wavy look. And if I feel it, it feels as if I've wet the paper, because when you're blending, you're working with inks and you're coloring it. So if you've done brush lettering, more advanced brush lettering with me, you'll know exactly how to do that. But this is a piece of tracing paper that I've worked on, and it actually worked really well. I was never sure about the blending, but it worked really well. The other pens are amazing to write on. And because it's so smooth, your pens actually glide right over. So it's actually quite pleasant to work on. And the paper I'm using is Croxley. This is my pad. All my pads have my name on, so I don't accidentally sell them. And this is just ordinary paper. It doesn't even have a gram weight on, but you do sometimes get one printed with a gram weight, but I think it's pretty much always the same. For tracing paper, if you're interested in how that is made, it is made to have low opacity so you can see through it and it allows the light to pass through. It was originally designed for architects and for engineers. And oh, excuse me, guys, the transparency is achieved by the careful selection of the raw materials and by the process. And there's various different processes to achieve that. But basically, cellulose fiber forms the basis of paper, and paper is usually from a wood species or also cotton fiber, but it also often has other things in it. So if you think of normal paper, it's made with the wood fibers, the cotton fibers, whatever it is, and other things to make it opaque. So with tracing paper, the whole ultimate goal is to remove all of those things, still keep the basis of the wood, the paper, and take out all the things that make it opaque, and you're making it less opaque. So it's a whole process. If you are interested in it, there's quite a lot of information about that. But essentially, you've made your paper see-through by taking out various things. But quite interesting. I always thought that it was made with something else. It has that sort of slightly plasticky feel to it. All right, so that is all the different papers. Just one other thing, cartridge paper. I don't use cartridge paper. I don't sell cartridge paper. And I've always heard the term and never really worried too much about it. And then I thought, well, let me find out what it is. And so if you see cartridge paper, and some art shops will sell it, the reason it's called cartridge paper is because it used to be used to pack cartridges, cartridge shells, so for guns. So they actually used to use that to wrap the shells in. So the word cartridge is coming from a gun cartridge, like a shotgun cartridge. So the word cartridge doesn't have anything to do with what the paper is made of. So cartridge paper is made from wood pulp, and the reason why I wouldn't recommend it for brush letching is because it seems to be, and I've tried to find from a couple of different sources. I don't have any, so I can't feel. I'm very much a touch and feel person with paper. It is apparently kind of rough, like a bit rough, not very rough, but better suited to things like charcoal drawing, pencil drawing, that kind of thing. So I would think it's more of a drawing, sketching kind of paper. And quite a few websites compared it to Bristol paper. So Bristol's a very smooth paper, and they said that's better for markers, and cartridge would be better for pens. So if you have some, use it for drawing, but I would probably stay away from it for brush pens. Okay, so that is all of those. Now I'm going to speak about the actual papers. Okay, so if I can just unmuddle myself. Okay, so when you're looking at papers, there are so many different kinds, and people will often ask me, and it's such a frustrating question because, with South Africa, I can't just say, oh, go to this shop and you'll have all the papers you want. People will say, what paper should I use? Which is partly why I'm doing all these workshops, because the first workshop I did was the what pen is this workshop. That was supposed to be an hour, and it was over 2 hours, and only about 10 minutes of it was paper. So I decided to do a paper one, because that is quite important. You can have the best quality, most expensive markers. You can have these beautiful Tombos. You can have lovely eco lines, all these fancy pens. You pick up a piece of bad quality copy paper, and not only is it going to look terrible, but you're going to damage your pen. So the paper is really, really important. So with paper, once you start talking about paper, all these terms come up, and a lot of times people will ask me about Rhodia paper. Now there's Clairefontaine paper that's in South Africa, available in South Africa. There is Hahnemühle paper. Even Tombow are doing Bristol paper, which I did not know about until I ordered some Tombows and saw that they had this paper. So I've done samples for all of them. Some of the papers are amazing, and they're still quite expensive because trying to get them here is always a nightmare, getting them from anywhere else, and exchange rate doesn't help. So I'm just going to explain very briefly Clairefontaine and Rhodia. Those are two names that you quite often hear. I knew Rhodia fairly well because I've used Rhodia paper for quite a long time. It's hard to find though. So Rhodia paper always has the orange cover. Sometimes it'll have a black cover. I'll show you those now. But just to explain very briefly, Rhodia and Clairefontaine are separate papers, but Clairefontaine owns Rhodia. So Clairefontaine have been making paper in France since 1858. Rhodia have been making paper also in France. So they're both French brands, but only since 1932, so which is still quite old. And in 1997, Clairefontaine bought Rhodia. But what happened is, because they're two very established brands, Clairefontaine bought Rhodia, but Rhodia paper is still made as Rhodia paper. So Clairefontaine makes it, but it's still Rhodia paper. And it is apparently always made on machine number 6, which is quite cool. So they have the special dedicated machine for Rhodia paper. Rhodia is always, and let me show you a pad so you actually know what I'm talking about. Rhodia is This is the orange pad. It is what is known as a staple bound pad. There are 3 staples up at the top. This is the logo. And Rhodia was started by 2 brothers, and the 2 trees, these are spruce trees. These 2 trees in the logo actually represent the 2 brothers. And the name Rhodia, and this was actually quite interesting. Rhodia, where is it in here? Rhodia was first made in 1934. The first pad was made in 1934 in Lyon, in France. And in Lyon, there is the Rhone River. And the Rhone River flows through Lyon, and the people who live in that region are known as the Rhodanians. So the name Rhodia came from that area. So the Rhodanians live in that area, and then the paper is Rhodia, which is quite cool because it's kind of a weird name, but that makes sense. Then these pads are always staple bound. So you don't tear off where it's glue at the top like with normal pads. You would tear off with a perforated edge, and then you've got your paper underneath. I see they do also have black pads, and then there are other paper, other colors. You know, if they make a specialized pad, they'll do a different color. But the orange cover dates back to the beginning. So they always had an orange cover, and it was it's still the same orange till today. So it's quite recognizable. Then with Clairefontaine paper, Clairefontaine staple bound, with the staples at the top, that's usually a 90-gram paper. Rhodia is usually an 80-gram paper. So those are really the only differences. Then the other very old brand, if you thought 1858 was old, which, look, in South Africa, that is old. I know if you live in Europe, that's not old. Hahnemühle, and I've lost my pad now. Hahnemühle is a German brand, and that was founded in 1584. So I think these guys know their stuff by now. They know what they're doing. All right. So what I'm going to do is just basically go, and we're really nearly on, it's nearly 12 o'clock. So the different paper types, if you are looking at Bristol. So Bristol is a city in the UK. Bristol paper is named for that city. The mills, way back in the day, all the mills, the best mills were in Bristol, and a lot of paper or pulp manufacturers, people who made paper, I can't remember exactly, I think it was the pulp guys, they would send everything to the factories in Bristol. The paper would be made there. So that's why it was called that. This is Canson Bristol. Okay, this is the one I mostly use. Canson is the brand, Bristol is the type of paper. XL is their cheaper student range. So when I say cheaper, it's a 180 gram, so it's less, it's lighter than most of the other Bristols. So it is a cheaper paper. And what I've done is, in making all these notes and that, I've also worked out an approximate price, because people say, well, what does cheap, or, what does that mean? So the XL sheets, this is a giant pad because I also cut them up for workshops, but an A4 version of this would be around about 145 Rand for a pad, 50 sheets in a pad. It works out to 3 Rand an A4. All the pads I'm showing you except this one are A4, so the prices are based on A4. So it would be about 3 Rand a sheet, which is fairly cheap for Bristol paper. But having said that, it is a much softer, flimsier paper. So I wouldn't use this for cards. However, it is the most divine paper ever. It holds its color. You can blend beautifully on there. I'm going to have these in my workshop file. So if you do ever want to have a look and you're at a workshop, I'll have all of these with me. What I've done is I've also written on the back of these papers. So what I'm checking for is, does it come through? And some papers you can write only on one side, and the other side it doesn't really work. So I have found with the Bristol, if you're using the big color markers, sometimes when you write on the back, it's a little bit more dull, but basically you can write on both sides, and then it doesn't come through. So here, there's all my color, and it doesn't come through onto this side. So really, really good paper. You can work on both sides. I will often test stuff on one side, turn it over, keep testing, and so in that way, it is quite cost effective. Then, and that's fairly readily available. So you're not, and don't even ask me about P&A, okay? Because P&A doesn't have any of these papers. So P&A will have tracing paper, and they'll have 1 or 2 of the other papers I'll show you. But all of these, you either need to order online, or you need to get them from a specialized art shop. So Herbert Evans, for instance, they're no longer in Rosebank, they're now in Linden, and they're in Fourways. they will have these, but they don't have the purple marker ones. They only have the yellow ones. Online shops will have them. When I have them, I sell them, but if you know what you're looking for, it's much easier. And it's quite nice that it's a bright one with that big XL on the front. Then you also get Canson Bristol, that is a 250 gram. So Canson being the manufacturer, a 250 gram works out. I don't sell them and I haven't used them, but I'd imagine based on how this one feels, it would be an amazing paper to work with. They work out at about R4.50 a sheet. So it's about 90 Rand for a pad. And those you can buy at places like, I think Herbert Evans would have those, Art Savings Club, you know, all the usual online shops. And please, if you're ever not sure, message me and ask me and I'll help you out, because it is confusing. So that is the Canson one. Oh, I'm just going to check this pad on the bed. I'm working in the guest house room, so just it's taking up my whole desk here. Then I've got some others that I wanted to try, and there is the Clairefontaine Bristol. So Clairefontaine is, the Bristol has the little bird on the front, and this is a 205 gram, which for me is a very weird kind of in-between size. In America, they will work on pounds. So it's pounds per ream. A ream is 500 sheets. So it's they would weigh the ream of paper, and that's how they would get the weight. So for grams, remember, it's per square meter. So the 205 gram Clairefontaine worked really, really well and has a nicer, heavier feel. This is the cheapy Canson one. And also blends beautifully, works beautifully. So all these Bristols are really, really nice. The Tombow one, also very nice paper. 250 gram, beautiful. I started writing and I was like, oh, you know, when you hear angels singing and then and the pens are gliding, everybody's happy. That's what these papers do for your markers. It is amazing. It is like putting a mop over a marble floor. All of those you mop, not me. Okay, so 250 gram Tombow Bristol, Bristol being the type of paper, Tombow being the brand. Tombow are the ones who make these markers. If you're doing scrapbooking or any of those crafts, you get the Tombow glue with the little dragonfly on it, same brand. It's a Japanese brand. There's a little dragonfly on there. And Japanese brand, very, very old. I'm not sure how old, but quite old. Also family owned. A lot of these companies, they started off being family owned, and you know, they have all these secrets and they pass them down. And Tombow is now kind of split into two sections. There's Tombow US and Tombow Europe. So if you think about it being Japanese, but you're mainly dealing with either Europe or the US. Tombow, this paper, I had never seen, I didn't even know they did paper, and because I only really did the markers. And this is now available in South Africa. I'm going to be selling this because it's amazing paper, same as this one. So these papers are, just in terms of price, they work out for the Clairefontaine one, the 205 gram, it would be about 7 to 8 Rand a sheet. And this one is about 9 Rand a sheet, which you might think, wow, that's a lot. But if you're making a card and you're wanting to work on it, it is expensive. But I think part of that is because they're not widely available in South Africa. So I think once they become more available, all these prices will come down. But definitely 250. You can see with the Tombow one, it's much, much thicker. It's going to bend beautifully into a card versus this Canson one, which is quite flimsy. Okay. And none of them bleed through. These are not coated. Bristol paper is not coated. It is a very densely packed, it's packed under pressure. So it's glued together. It's a whole lot of layers, and it's glued together under pressure. And that is what causes this quite dense. If you feel it, you know what I mean. It's got a very dense, very smooth feel to it. It is hot press, so they'll make the paper and then they go and they would actually roll it with a hot roller. There are two different surface types. There's the very smooth and there's the vellum surface. So a very smooth surface is what I would use for brush lettering, and you can feel it has that. This is always the reaction. People, they just want to touch it. And so vellum, the surface would be slightly rougher. So if you're working with bristles and you buy them, so Strathmore, for instance, that yellow pad, I don't have any here, but I've seen that where on the front, it'll say either smooth surface or vellum surface. And that's quite important. So if you buy the wrong one, if you buy the vellum Bristol, you might think, well, it's Bristol. Why is it not working so well? It's designed for pencil, graphite, charcoal, that kind of thing. So, or, you know, pastels, crayons. So vellum Bristol is for that. And then and you get that nice sort of grainy look when you color with it. And then the smooth, Bristol Smooth, is going to be for markers, and it's designed so that your colors sit nicely. If you look at one of these pads, I'll show you on the layout paper. It's got all these little bits of information at the bottom, and I'll show you now what I mean. So that is Bristol. There is also Fabriano Bristol, which the best way to work out if it's expensive or not, because you might see, oh, 104 Rand. Fabriano, I just went and I looked at various online shops in South Africa just to get an idea of prices. Fabriano is 104 Rand a pad. It's 20 sheets. If you work it out per sheet, that's 5 Rand 20. I hope my maths. I did it on Excel spreadsheet. The price per sheet is 5 Rand 20. So if you're just randomly practicing and you're playing, it starts to get expensive. But if you're wanting to do something nice and you're wanting to make a little picture, or you feel like working on nice paper, it's actually not too bad, unless you're going to go through, the whole 20 sheets in one sitting. But always work out, just take your pad price, divide it by the number of pages, and you can work out what it is per sheet. So I think tracing paper would be a good guideline, printer paper even, just, I don't really know what a sheet of cheap paper would cost. Very cheap layout paper, which I'll show you just now, is about 1 Rand 20 a page. So 9 Rand a page, it's starting to get expensive. But if you're doing a really nice card, it's worth it, especially if you look at what a card costs. So, or if you're punching out shapes, or you're doing gift tags or whatever, it's quite nice to use the right paper. Okay, so that is Bristol. The next one I'm going to talk about is the bleed-proof marker paper. Okay, so bleed-proof marker paper, bleed-proof, as I said before, meaning your ink will not bleed through onto the other side. Okay, so even on quite a thinnish paper, you will see I was blending. So this is the Rhodia, for instance, 80 gram paper, quite a flimsy paper. There is ghosting. This black, by the way, this over here, all the lines drawn around the edge and all the small writing is done with an oil-based Tombow. It's called a monotwin, and it has a thick end and a thin end. It's an oil-based pen, so meaning you can write on, I could write on a coffee cup or a plate. So that is going to go through anything. So if you look at the back, don't look at that where it's done with, you can see the oil-based pen, but you can see, if I hold it up to the light, I mean, I'm holding it up to, the window here, you can kind of see everything through there, but it hasn't bled through. There's a little bit of ghosting coming through here, but this is an 80 gram paper, and it's like that. That's why Rhodia is such a good paper. So just to show you those pads, I'm just going to move these out the way. And guys, if you need pictures of anything afterwards, if you want to buy something, you're welcome just to message me. All right, so Canson XL marker, for those of you that have done workshops with me, you all kind of know this one. Marker paper is paper that is designed for markers. So in South Africa, we'll often talk about brush kokies or kokies. They're actually markers. The rest of the world calls them markers. So that's what marker means. And XL, again, that's the cheapest student range. And they designed it for students, art students who are going through a lot of paper. So that's why XL, it's like it's cheaper, high volume of paper. Nothing wrong with it. This is amazing paper. So don't be put off by that. Don't be too much of a paper snob. So Canson marker paper is semi-transparent, meaning it's really nice for, again, if you've got an alphabet sheet and you're wanting to trace your letters, practice your letters, you can pretty much see through this. This one is a sealed one, but it's got a beautiful silky smooth feel to it. It's a 70 gram paper coated on the back. So bleed proof paper generally has a coating on it. Remember what I said earlier, it's like a clay or a pollen or something. And if you try and write on it, the ink kind of pulls a little bit and on the back of the paper. So although this works out at R1.65 a sheet, you can only really write on one side. So, so it's not like the Bristol where you can work on both sides. Then there is the this one that I discovered. This I struggle to get, just by the way. If you see it, buy it. It's about 165 Rand a pad. But because I couldn't get it very easily, and I was teaching with Monique, I was teaching a dipping pen workshop. So these are dipping pen, the dipping pens that we use, very, very sharp nib. You have to write on the right paper because otherwise the nibs hook into the paper and they pick up the fibers. So we needed a bleed proof paper, and I decided to test this one. They didn't personalize it, that's me writing with a metallic brush marker on the top there. So this is the Shinhan Art Touch paper. The Shinhan Art Touch markers are these over here. It's a alcohol marker, and this paper was designed by them for their marker. So I thought, okay, let me try it. Works really, really well. It's the paper that we put into our kits. When you buy a kit like this, you get a pad of this, pad of tracing paper, and you get the notes. Very, very nice paper. It just looks like normal paper if you're looking at it on the screen. Feels beautiful, nice and smooth, and it works really well with these pens, and it works nicely with all the inks. It doesn't feather too much. When you're working with a pen like this and with fountain pen ink, you can get a bit of feathering if you are working on the wrong paper. So this works nicely. Marker paper works beautifully, the Canson marker, and all of these bleed-proof markers will work with these pens. This paper works out at about R2.70 a sheet, which is more expensive than the other paper, but you can write on both sides. It's maybe not as nice on the other side, but you definitely can flip it over and write on both sides. So it is more economical than the Canson one in that way, or kind of as economical. Okay, then there is the Clairefontaine layout paper. So I'm showing you this because it's amazing paper, but kind of hard to find in South Africa. I saw Art Savings Club had it. Their price it's about $2.50 for the pad, but there's 70 sheets in here. So it works out to R3.60 per sheet for this paper. I just want to check here. I don't think I wrote on both sides of this one. Oh no, I did. Sorry, that's the layout. Too many samples and they all look the same. Yeah, that is my Clairefontaine layout paper sample. So that is this one here, this Clairefontaine paper. And on the back, you can see where I did the blending. So, and I did the same blending, same everything on all the papers, including the tracing paper. And you'll see over here, it's not bled right through, but there's definitely ghosting, and you can feel it a little bit. That's for the blending. So this layout paper, it's a 75 gram. It is a coated paper, a bleed-proof paper, but it definitely, it wasn't ideal for blending. So if you're practicing blending, rather go with, you can use the Rhodia paper or you can use the Bristol. But for general writing, it was beautiful to write on. It's lovely, lovely paper. And it's a layout paper, so if you're using it for proper layout and you're drawing and you're doing sketching, that kind of thing, these papers are all great for that. This is, yeah, it says for markers and for liners. And the picture of the mark on the front looks almost like one of those alcohol markers, so I'm sure it'll be fine for that. Okay, so that is the Clairefontaine. Then the Rhodia one, which I'll show you. So Rhodia comes in different paper, different patterns. You get a plain, which is obviously plain, no lines at all. Then you get a lined one, and you get dot, and you get grid. So the grid is just squares, and the dot one is obviously dots, like this, like almost like what you'd use for bullet journaling. And the lined one has quite narrow lines, so it's lined, but if you hold it next to one of our school books or exam pads, the lines are actually narrow, so it's you'd write fairly small on there. Stunning paper to write on. It's probably my favorite of all papers. The Rhodia pads are different sizes. I know I did touch on this in the What Pen Is This workshop, but I'm just going to mention it again. When you see Rhodia pads, if you do manage to buy them, you might see some say number 19, some say number 18. So what that means is a number 19 pad is taller, and they're all staple bound like this, and they all have that, so you can see I've used mine, where that section where you tear off. On a number 18 pad, it is the entire pad that is A4. On the number 19, the paper from there to there is A4. So if you're needing your whole sheet, once you've torn it off, to be A4, then you buy number 19. And it just gives you that section as being extra, and then your A4 goes from there down. The only time that really makes a difference is if you're doing something where you need your paper to be A4 or you want to fold it in half to a proper A5. I use this paper for bookbinding, for making bullet journals, and I needed the number 19 because when you fold it in half, it needs to be exactly A5. So that's where it would be useful. Otherwise, if you don't really mind and you actually want your pad to fit in with all your other pads that are generally a proper A4 size, you don't want one sticking up like that, then rather get the number 18. Number 19s are quite difficult to find, so generally it's not going to be an issue. But if you're wondering, that's what that's about. Okay, the rodeo paper is amazing. I did show you just now. There is nothing going through except that oil-based pen that I used. But where I blended on an 80-gram paper, I mean, that looks pretty good. And it's not all rough and bumpy at the back, a little bit bumpy, but it's a stunning paper to use. So I've used it quite a lot for these pens as well. And if you're working with something like a glass pen, so Ali, you'll back me up on this, you're also wanting a smooth surface. For your glass nib, you know, those proper glass pens, you don't want a rough surface to work over. So rodeo paper, any of these bleed-proof papers, the marker papers that I've talked about, great for these because you've got a very sharp point in it, but also nice for something like the glass pen where you actually want it to flow nicely and you don't want it kind of jumping over the paper. So I would recommend these. I am working on trying to get these because they're amazing and you can't find them. So I will probably put them all over Facebook and Instagram when I do. Otherwise, that marker paper, the purple one, if you see that, get that. This is Copic bleed proof. It's made by Pro Art, but it's marketed as the Copic blending pad, and that is also really nice. I have got I've used it quite a bit for dipping pens, glass pens, fountain pens. It's just a smooth white paper, so it's pretty much like all the other ones. Easier to find sometimes, again, probably not at P&A, but you can order these online, and it always looks like this. Since I've started teaching years ago, it kind of always looked like that with the Copic markers on the front. That paper is about 80 Rand a pad, which works out about 3.20 Rand per sheet. You cannot write on the other side. It does that thing where it pulls the ink. So maybe with one of these, if you're working with a heavier ink, like a Sumi ink, you might be able to, but for markers, you're pretty much working on only the one side. So it does work out a little bit expensive in that way. And then the last one I want to show you is the Hahnemühle pad. So Hahnemühle, they're the ones that have been around since 15 something. German paper, and beautiful. Also, oh gosh, you open it up, you touch the paper, and it's like, oh, angels singing. And amazing to write on. This is marketed as a hand lettering pad. So it's a Hahnemühle hand lettering pad. So it's actually been designed for hand lettering, completely smooth, and 25 sheets, 170 grams. And when you write with it, just find my sample. Also beautiful, beautiful to write on. There is my sample one. This feels amazing. Tiny bit of, like so tiny you can hardly see it, little bit of ghosting. And then I wrote the word on the back, and you don't see that coming through the front. So for me, that's the most important, that you're not seeing your words coming through, ghosting through. Even the oil-based marker, you can't really see that as well. So this is a really nice paper. That one works out about 7.20 Rand a sheet. So again, it's a imported paper that is not that easy to find. And I do think with all these, the prices will start coming down. So those are the marker and bleed-proof marker and Bristol papers. Okay, any questions about those? I feel like I've just thrown information at you. So I'm recording this so you can go back and look. And please don't feel like, oh my gosh, I now have to go and, you know, spend a fortune on paper. A pad like this, if you're practicing your blending, you can take a pad like this and just practice a bit in the corner, keep the sheet, practice a bit more at some point. You don't need to, you know, if you buy the pad, and I'm saying, oh, this costs 7 Rand a sheet and that costs whatever a sheet, those sheets last quite a while. I've got pads that I've had for ages. And if you're wanting to practice your lettering, tracing paper, and I have another secret weapon here. So, okay, this applies to South Africa. So you guys overseas that can probably get all these German and French paper. Cindy, I'm looking at you for this. You'll definitely be able to get all these much, much cheaper. They're all made new.
I've already been looking.
Yeah, exactly. So Cindy's in Belgium. So, I mean, all these French and German papers, you've got no problem there. So to me, they're expensive, but only because they are imported papers. And that's what messes everything up for us. So,
I kind of tend to lean towards the Canson papers.
yeah, Canson, I know, when I was doing all this testing, I was so amazed at how well, even the Canson XL, which is like the cheapy range, maybe cheaper in price, but definitely not in quality. I'm sure it's in the manufacturing process. It's somehow a cheaper process and it's a thinner paper, but wow, those are amazing. And the Canson Bristol, the normal, not that, so the one I'm showing you all the time is that bright yellow one. Like the normal Canson, which is a 250 gram, has a blue, like a blue and white cover. So, and that you can get, I think Art Savings Club had it, or there are a few places. Stencil Art might have. There are places in Cape Town, Decor Edge, Brush and Canvas. They all sell art stuff. So if you're wanting a thicker weight, then go with the Canson normal Bristol. Or if you're wanting just to mess around, like I do, most of what I do is just samples, stuff for Instagram, and samples for my books, for my workshops. But if I'm making a card, I will often use the Bristol and then cut that, maybe color right on the edge with gold or something, and then stick that onto a thicker 250 or 300 gram paper. But yeah, I agree with you. Canson is, they're amazing. Okay, so in South Africa, we have, yeah, was there a question? Sorry.
Yes, I just want to ask, you mentioned that the tracing paper would be good for brush calligraphy or brush pens.
Yes.
Which practice paper would you recommend for dip pen practice, also where you want to trace?
You can use tracing paper. You can use exactly the same. So this Croxley, if you come to a workshop with us, this is what we give you to practice on, the normal Croxley tracing paper. You get other brands, but I just happen to buy it. I like the black and like the pattern. And also price. This I think is about 60 rand a pad, something like that. 30 sheets. That's too much maths for me. What is that? 2 rand a sheet? Am I right? No, I don't know. Someone else. This is a paper lesson, not a maths lesson. So absolutely, tracing paper is perfect. And if you write on tracing paper, because of that process, remember I said it has that sort of weird plasticky feel, the whole process of making it transparent by removing all these things and so on seems to make it quite suitable for a dip pen, a very pointed dip pen that's designed to split. It has no problem because there's no fibers to pick up. Tracing paper is nice and smooth. You might feel and think it feels slightly rough. Somehow your pens glide over it. It's the weirdest feeling. For brush pens, they kind of just glide right over the paper. I'm not sure, even though it has a slight roughness to it. Not rough, it's just a texture. And certainly for dip pens and glass pens, you can use these. So I will often give people tracing paper in the workshop. And also in those kits, if you buy one of the kits that has this and the ink and the notes and all that, a pad of this is actually included. A pad of this and a pad of the white bleed-proof paper. So tracing paper, I think, is pretty much tracing paper. I don't know if there's a better quality, but certainly Croxley. And the other one that I've used is actually this layout brand. This is a marker paper, but it's the same brand as this, where it says Express It, and it was Pro Art at one time. So I'm not exactly sure who they are now, but it's the same pattern on the front. So their paper, their tracing paper pad is this color. I do have one somewhere, just not with me here. It's that color. Perfect for perfect.
I do have two different ones to try today.
Have you got? Oh yeah.
So you can maybe give a better answer to that a little later today. But I have a cheaper one and I have an expensive one.
Did you write on them yet? Or are you going to try them just now?
I first need to learn how to hold my pen.
Oh yeah, you're going to be in the lesson later on. Perfect.
Yeah.
So I expect great things after that lesson. So yeah, you can tell me after that. But tracing paper is amazing. And it's kind of easy to find. You can walk in, I'm sure you can even buy it in C&A, which is, they don't sell anything so anymore, anything decent. So yeah, Ali, was it your chat I saw there now? 30 years old, oh my word. Yeah, it's like ink as well. If you look after it, it should work perfectly. All right, then the paper that I wanted to just tell you about here is called layout paper. So now I've shown you Clairefontaine layout paper. This is bleed proof, coated, blah, blah, blah. This is just called layout paper because it's thin and you can kind of see through it, but it's not a coated, it's not marketed as a coated marker paper. So this is the 46 gram, 46 GSM, and this one is the 60. The green pad is the 60. There's not really a difference in how they behave in terms of writing on. The one is just thinner. The 46 grams is thinner, so you can see things through. So if you're tracing practice sheets, for instance, you would probably see them a lot more easily through the 46. I just want to put something behind there. Oh yeah, I've put one of my samples behind there. You can actually see the word Tombow sticking right through, and this is on a sheet of 46 gram paper, and it comes through nicely. So if you're wanting to practice on that, you can. And the other big surprise for me was, and I need to find it, was how nicely it blends. Oh guys, where's my, I'm now in the process of burying myself under things. So I got my other samples. There was one for this paper. It blends beautifully. So you can definitely use that as an alternative. You know, it's got a rougher, slightly rougher feel. In fact, when you feel it, you might think, are you sure this is okay for my pens? It works beautifully. So it's just not as smooth as the layout papers. This would be about 60 Rand for, this is 50 sheets. I have my prices here. So that is, I did work that out somewhere, but it's quite a cheap alternative. Okay. P&A, I think, have these, and definitely all the art shops and that would have, but I'm pretty sure I even bought this at P&A. And I know Santon Stationery and Print have, a lot of the sort of normal stationery shops would have these, because this is not really an art paper as such. It's layout paper, which is like slightly thicker than tracing paper, but it works really, really nicely. Okay, so that is all of those papers. Then, oh, here we go, 120. Yeah, it is about 120 a sheet. So that's really cheap. You just can't really use both sides because it does show through on the other side. So, but it works nicely for your pens, so you can definitely practice on that. And you can use this for dipping pens, for these sharp dipping pens. All right. Then I'm going to just show you quickly a couple other papers. Black paper. People often ask me about black paper. So I have a sheet of paper. The paper that I've got here is a 90 gram paper. It's just paper. It's not a card. You do get it in a thicker card. I just happen to have the 90 here. This is called deep black paper. That is actually its name. And I'm actually going to sell this one because it's such a nice paper to write on. And also beautiful for these pens if you're working with white ink, gold ink, any of those sort of inks. And if you work with iridescent inks, they work differently on black to on white. So it's quite nice to play around with that. Then a paper like this, I mean, the color is like so stunning. It's this hot pink. It's actually called Bougainvillea, the color. It's Marlboro paper. So I went to Paper Cafe in Rosebank. If you don't know where Paper Cafe is, keep it that way because you'll have money and I won't. Paper Cafe, you walk in and it's just like, here, take all my money, just give me all the papers. It is a very dangerous place, and they have this in all different colors. The reason I'm showing you this is not specifically for the color, but because you might see something like this and think, oh, it's so beautiful, it will work nicely with my brush pens. Just because it's pretty and it comes from a nice place doesn't necessarily mean it will work nicely. I've written with this on this paper with the small Tombow pens. It works beautifully. These are permanent ink. By feeling it, I would be inclined not to use my bigger water-soluble pens like these. If I had a black one here and I tried it, it would probably go a little bit almost grayish. This paper doesn't feel like a coated paper. It's beautiful, but you need a stronger ink. I would stay away from this for the bigger brush pens. But if you're working with these, again, if you're working in black or one of the stronger inks like the golds and that, this kind of paper would be great. A paper that I would definitely be careful of is Star Dream paper. This is a sheet of red. I don't know if you can see the shimmer. This is a red sheet, but the gold, after the cream with the gold shimmer, oh man, that is like the most popular for weddings. And when I still used to do some wedding work, because I don't anymore, chances are it would be this flipping cream gold Star Dream paper. This color, but with this finish. It is so slippery to work on. So when you're working with these pens, as you're writing, the ink is sort of slipping on the paper. It's beautiful paper, but difficult to work with. So be very careful. You might see a paper like, oh, it's so beautiful. It is lovely, but I would work with an ink like the gone blank, the Sumi ink, that black Sumi ink, the very thick ink. I would not work on this with fountain pen ink. Fountain pen ink, I've tried it, and it kind of pools and it goes very, very pale and dull. It's even the black Lamy ink, which is normally pretty good. Horrible on this paper. So always just be careful. And if you're ever not sure and you go somewhere like Paper Cafe, buy one sheet. You can buy a single sheet, or this is the thicker one. You can buy a paper as well. Buy it, test it, and then you can always, or take your pen with you. Buy a sheet, test it there and then you can decide if you want more, because it's stunning paper, but very hard to write on because of that shimmery coating. Just one thing with watercolor paper, you are completely able to use that with your brush pens. It has some kind of coating on it. So people often ask me, oh, I have watercolor paper. Here's a 140 gram, fairly cheap. This is actually mixed media paper. It's that Amadeo one with the lady's head on the front. This one here, the lady's face, that one. PLA, easy to find, 140 gram, quite thin. If you can't find decent paper, just buy this. And the reason why I say it's fine for brush pens, even though it's rough, it's got a roughish feel, they size this with gelatine. So when watercolor paper is made, it's either made where they mix the size into the vat of paper. So when your paper is made, it's mixed into it, or they will coat it afterwards. But however the method, whichever method they use, it is coated for your brush pens to be safe. So your fibers of your brush pens will kind of glide over. You'll feel that slight bump, but it's not going to damage your pens like an uncoated, like a rough paper would. Okay. Then I wouldn't use it too much, but it's definitely something you can use. Then just with the paper, just want to find, I did a sample, which I've lost, my Typic sample. I have in the office here in the guest house, we use Typic paper, and mainly because the place where I shop, that's the paper that they sell. So I didn't think too much of it. And then one time we ran out of paper. Chris happened to go to Macro and he bought rot-ring paper, and I printed, so I use it for printing notes. I thought, wait, this paper feels horrible. I looked and it was a different brand. And what I realized is that the printer paper, there are also different feels to it. So Typic, the red one, is actually a really, really nice one to use. And I decided to test it, and that's what I'm looking for now. I tested it with my pens. Now, I've always said do not use printer paper under any circumstances because it will kill your pens. However, it worked really, really well because I thought I'll give it a try. And if I kill the pen, well, it's in the name of science. On the Typic paper, my brush pens, even the blending worked really well. Damn it, that's the one I can't find. Even that was quite amazing how it blended. I would not try that on the rot-ring. I think it was the black with the orange. I'm pretty sure it was rot-ring. So although I always say, here it is, don't use copy paper, printer paper. Here is my sample on Typic paper, which is actually not too bad. It blended beautifully. The only thing though is if you're blending and you stop and you get distracted with something else and you come back, because it's not a bleed-proof marker or a hot press paper, it's just printer paper, your ink dries and then you've got a line. So if you're blending, I actually try that. I stopped on that piece there. I stopped and then I left it and then I came back and I had to pick up more ink to kind of blend across that line. So it wasn't terrible. It did also bleed through a little little bit on the back. I don't know if you can see there, but I mean, it's copy paper. It's 80-gram copy paper, but it has quite a nice smooth feel to it. So I'm not suggesting that you use that for your pens generally, but if you stuck and you want to practice a bit of blending, it's not the end of the world if you use this. I did feel though that the pens kind of dragged a bit as I wrote, although it was quite a lot better than I thought. The pens did feel like there's a bit of resistance. So I would tend to stay away from that, but I thought just to let you know, it is quite a nice paper. It also seemed to be a much better paper to print on, just from a printing point of view. And I went and I researched about Typek copy paper, and it is made with the waste from the sugarcane production. So it's actually got sugarcane fiber. So well, it's a sappy product. They seem to think that made it a better paper. So who knows? Okay, so so that is the Typek here. Oh, here is the Pro Art layout paper. So that these pads that I was showing you earlier, these ones here, I found my sample, and that is how it blended very nicely. But you can see it just goes straight through onto the other side. I mean, you can actually see, I didn't even write on the back. You can see how thin that is. So it is only for practicing on one side, but it's cheap enough that that's not an issue. Okay. Then the black paper I showed you. Black paper, by the way, when you have paper like this that I showed you, this deep black paper, I'm not going to tear this because it's going to be a waste, but if I did have to tear this, you would see it's black all the way through. So what happens with a lot of cheaper black papers, you'll go somewhere like P&A and you see, oh, black paper, and you buy a pack of it, and you get home and you cut it or you tear it, or you try and erase on it and you get that dull, weird dull patch, and you tear it and it's white, or you look at the edge of the paper, the cut edge, and you'll see it's white. All they've done is they've colored it on the back and the front. Proper paper like this is actually dyed through. So they will, that's the name of the process, that's dyed through. And they will use a proper deep black dye to do this. Like they would use for the pink or the red or whatever color it is. It's a proper jet black dye. And it's got a slightly matte surface. If you're working with brush pens, none of your brush pens are going to show up on here anyway, unless you're using a white one like the Kelly Creates Moonlight one. But for inks and that, and for working with gel pens, if you're working with a white, I don't know if I've got one here, I don't. A white gel pen or a white paint marker, these papers are amazing for that. Okay, guys, I think, oh yeah, just one last thing. Craft paper, I have some to show you here. This is, it's recycled paper. So craft, I'm just taking it out to show you. Craft paper is like this. It's a brown paper. It is lovely paper. It's very rough. I would not use brush pens on this unless you wanted to do one word and you knew, okay, you're taking a risk, press lightly. If you're using pens like these little Tombos, they are fairly durable. I wouldn't write a lot, but if you had to write a word or two, it's not going to be the end of the world. I'd be more inclined to do fake calligraphy on this. We're using a fine line and coloring in. If you're working with these pens, this paper is a nightmare. I've written, if you've seen on Instagram, I had one where it was on this paper and I'd written in white ink and it looks amazing, and the white and the brown, and oh my gosh, the fibers, these little nibs that if you see here, if I press the two pointed ends, if you can see there, they do that. So as you're writing, they are literally picking up the fibers, and what will happen is you don't notice. You go to do something like an oval, and the fiber drags the ink across your letter. It's like, oh, then you've got to start again. So as you're writing, if you're working with one of these pens, as you're dipping and you write, check or have a tissue, wipe off the end and dip it again, just to take off any fibers, because it is a nightmare to work with. Stunning paper, very, very cheap. I think it's like $50 for a pad of 20 sheets. It's quite cheap. And it's recycled. It's beautiful with gold as well, the gold ink. And definitely if you're working with the alcohol markers, it will go through, maybe not, it's quite thick. I need to test that. But it's a beautiful paper to play with. Okay, and for card making, that kind of thing, it's really nice. All right, guys, I think, unless you have questions. Oh gosh, I'm gonna keep looking through my pile and finding more stuff to show you. I'm just going to quickly discuss the mixed media and the graph paper, because I do get asked about mixed media. I've got mixed media paper. So that Amadeo paper with the lady on the front, that is marketed as mixed media paper. It's kind of hard to see what the difference is. To me, it looks like watercolor paper. I'm sure it's in the manufacturing process. And if you do watercolor painting, you might pick up a difference. This is mixed media paper. It has a different feel to that Amadeo paper. When I wrote on it, wow, this was really, really good to write on. And I was quite surprised. If you have that paper, and this is my sample that I did for that mixed media paper. I think mixed media paper might all be different depending on the brand. This is the Canson one, also the XL one. And someone gave me this. I didn't specifically go and buy it, but having tested it, I would definitely use it. There's my blend. It blended beautifully. No bleeding. It is a 160 grams, so it's got quite a nice thickness. But here I've written on the back, and there's nothing coming through. Even the oil-based pen, you can hardly see that where I've done that heading. So that is a nice paper. A lot of people already have it, people who are doing mixed media, so you can definitely use your pens. And where I wrote with the color Tombow, it kept that beautiful ombre effect that you want with those pens. Okay, and the last paper I want to show you, I promise it really is the last, there's nothing left on the pile, is graph paper. So graph paper I use when I'm teaching traditional calligraphy. I would not use this for brush lettering, okay? So this paper has little blocks on it, and it can get a bit confusing. So I'm just going to show you what that means with, here's my fountain pens. And if I take a normal fountain pen with a pointed nib, like I showed you just now, that's not what you'd use this paper for. You need to use it with a calligraphy nib, calligraphy pen. So here is one that has a 1.9 size nib. So with calligraphy nibs, without going into too much detail, you get different widths. 1.9 is a nice wideish nib. The paper, the graph paper, you get different sizes of blocks. So it's always very important that you get the correct size. If you look at the bottom, it says here in very tiny letters, ruled 2, 10, 20. And what that means is your blocks are ruled with the littlest block being 2 mils. 5 of those blocks is 10 millimeters, 1 centimeter. And that from there to there is 20 millimeters. It's 10 blocks. Each block is 2 millimeters. So 10 of those blocks is going to give you 20 millimeters or 2 centimeters. Why that is important is if you're using a 1.9 nib, that is almost 2 mils, or you're using one of those calligraphy markers that says 2 on it. You get the Artline ones, you get a set with 1, 2, 3. It's 1 mil, 2 mil, 3 mil. A 2 mil nib, when you're working with calligraphy, your letter height works on your nib height. So if you want to know how big to make your letter, you'd use 5 nib heights. So if you're looking at a 1.9 mil, almost, they're German, I don't know why they couldn't just have done as a 2 mil. What is this 1.9 nonsense? And it's almost 2 mils. My block height is 5, okay, block being one of those, because it's got the slightly darker thing around it. And each letter would then be the size of one of those blocks. So if I did an N, for instance, and I wrote it on this size paper, the block is the perfect size for my 1.9 pen. And that's how, if I took a 6 mil pilot parallel or a 1 mil, a 1.1 mil Lamy, and I tried to do the same size letter using the same, it would look ridiculous. You need to multiply. So if it's a pilot 6 mils, you'd go 6 mils times 5 nib heights. Your letter needs to be much higher. But this paper is perfect for this size pen. So if you're practicing calligraphy and you've got a calligraphy marker size 2, which is the most common size of marker, this paper is really nice to use. And that's what that means, that 2, 10, 20. And that's why you want to try and get the right block size. You also get those maths, you know, the ones that the kids use, the bigger blocks. Doesn't work for us because there's no differentiation. All the blocks are the same size and they're all too big. So that's what with the graph paper. A lot of calligraphy teachers will use graph paper. I was taught with graph paper as well, and it was for that reason. It does not apply to brush lettering. Too many blocks for brush lettering. Okay, any questions? Hopefully nothing technical, no technical questions. I have to go back and find the notes. Anything,
Robyn,
guys? Yes.
That last paper that you showed, is that slightly transparent or not at all?
This one here, the graph
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah.
So the graph paper, this does not have a gram weight printed on it. It is kind of thin. So if I had to put something behind it, you're not really going to see it. If I just take one of these samples that I've been showing you and I put that behind, let me just put that down here. You're not really going to see it. So you can kind of see the word, but it's not like a layout paper or a tracing paper. I would not recommend that you put anything like, because you're not going to see it. So are you wanting to use it as a kind of a layout paper or?
I was just wondering if I could use it for both tracing and then freehand practice.
No, the graph paper, but is this for brush lettering? Because this
for dip.
For dipping. So these blocks are very, very upright. Where it messes you up for dip pen is often with dip pen, you want to go a little bit more slanty. So unless you write very, very upright. But I find that this paper is a little bit, everything's kind of like this. And the blocks are tiny. So look where my N is. There's all those blocks there. I would suggest if you're doing dip pen, are you talking about dip pen in this style before?
No, broad edge.
So the calligraphy, are you wanting to do it for this style of writing?
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm assuming because the one I teach is, because you know it's all about me. The one I teach is like this. Yeah. So if you are, are you wanting to draw? Yeah, because if you put your normal, okay, so for those of you who don't know, if you take a normal calligraphy dipping nib, where your actual nib, instead of being pointed like this, will look like this, but you'd stick it into the holder. So that's what we're talking about now, where you've got a flat calligraphy nib, and your nib will write like this. So what you can do is you could put a piece of tracing paper over this and trace, but are you wanting to trace letters?
Yes.
Okay.
So like foundational hand.
Yeah. So, and foundational hand is quite a chunky style. So what you can do is if you've got a practice sheet, you're not going to be able to use the tracing paper and this and the graph paper. I would just put the tracing paper straight over the notes and write. Or if you, depending on how good you are, you could always write out a letter on, you know, one or a whole page of letters and just use that to trace over. But you're not going to see through this paper. So what you can try and do is, there's loads and loads of practice sheets, because foundational hand is quite an old style. There are hundreds of sheets. Go and look for a practice sheet, and this goes for any style. You want to practice something, go and look for like free printable pages, foundational hand, like or Gothic or whatever it is, and try and find one that maybe has some grids printed on it, so that when you print your sheet, it already has those blocks on there. Because foundational hand, you want it very, very upright and it's quite chunky. So yeah, then the grid paper helps. But I would look for that. Somebody will have done that. I don't teach foundational hand, but if I did, I would have made sheets. Like my italic notes it's on this paper, so that when you've got the notes, you actually are looking at them on the graph paper and you can see how many blocks you need to use. So I'm sure you'll find something like that. Okay. Any other questions about anything to do with paper or pens? Guys, I'm surprised I still have a voice. I should have known an hour will be not long enough. I never know with these workshops how much I need to talk about. Apparently a lot. So.
Hi, can you hear me,
Yes,
Robyn?
I can hear you. Yes, hi.
Great, thank you. I know nothing about these stupid Zoom things. Anyway.
No, I can hear you, don't worry.
You know what, in terms of sort of archival and everything, you know, like the scrapbooks use all the acid-free and linen-free. Is there any difference in the actual papers? Does the ink last no matter what paper you put it on?
Yeah, I think it would. So I would rather, if you're talking specifically about scrapbooking, I would ask maybe, you know, either in a group or whoever you're doing scrapbooking with, I would ask them. But if you're talking about some normal, like a fountain pen ink, or
even the brush, yeah. You know, let's say for the bullet journal or whatever, which is not fancy paper.
Yeah. So,
would the ink last, even though the paper will go yellow?
The ink will. So if you've kept your book closed, for instance, your ink should last. Where it fades is where you've got light coming in. If you're wanting to pass those on as aliens, I can't guarantee how long it'll last.
No,
But
there's too much diary entry in there. Thank you.
oh yeah, you don't want any evidence. Yeah. So what I find is, for instance, if I take one of my samples now that I've written, and this happens to be the Hahnemuller paper. It's a coated, bleed-proof, acid-free. I think this one is even pH neutral. It has everything. If I take this piece and I go home and I put it on the table or on the windowsill in the direct sunlight, I can guarantee you that part will fade. This will go almost completely. It'll disappear. This will fade a lot. Even this part will kind of fade. It's the sunlight, even on this amazing paper, if I leave it in direct sunlight. But that's like the worst case scenario. So if you've written in something like your journal, no, it should absolutely last. Even if it's just on like a sort of normal, like it's a typo journal, and you write with your pens. I mean, I've got journals that are a couple of years old already, typo ones. I don't spend a lot of money on journals because mine are, it's just a running to-do list, to be honest.
And or anything.
Yeah, there's no drawings or anything like that. And the ink lasts absolutely perfectly. So definitely, especially if you're using a permanent ink, like these little Tombos, even the color ones. I think you've got the color ones.
I have,
They're permanent. So they should be I'm holding the wrong one. That's the monotone. This is the permanent ink in the small brush pen. That will definitely
So that will
last.
never fade.
No, it shouldn't fade at all, as long as you've kept the book closed. And you know, like I explained earlier, the heat, the humidity. But I mean, where we live in Joburg, it's so nice and dry, but it's not crazy dry. It's actually quite a nice climate for this. If you live somewhere like Cape Town and you had a damp problem or humidity in Durban or something,
then you'd move to Joburg again.
Yeah, absolutely. But then you're going to keep your journal somewhere safe, in a drawer somewhere that's not in direct sunlight, or not in a room that gets very, very humid. So no, they should be absolutely fine. The archival is more, it's, you know, for all these historical documents. And I know with the scrapbooking, people are often putting photos in and all sorts of sentimental things. So I think in that case, it's quite important that you're using proper acid-free, but I think it might be more for preserving the photos and so on. But again, I'm not 100% sure. But for what you're doing, it should be absolutely fine, as long as you keep it closed. And you know, because I've had things fade, like this kind of thing fade after a day or so, just in direct sunlight, especially these ones that are water soluble. That the ink is designed to
you would imagine that.
Yeah, it literally
why I asked,
color out.
Why I asked is because when my son had his bar mitzvah, we got everybody to write messages to him on a, you know, sort of piece of cardboard around his photo, and then we framed it. And the one pen we had has disappeared.
Oh my gosh.
Pens, and one of them has disappeared. You can't read it anymore. So
it was
in terms of
probably
that,
a water-based ink. So when I was talking earlier, right at the beginning, about Lightfast for paper, it's the same for ink. So not all ink is as Lightfast as other ink, and certainly these water-soluble type pens. And certain gel pens, I've had that as well, where I'll have written something, and you know, a year or two later, and it can be in gel pen, and maybe it was just not even in direct sunlight, just maybe lying on the desk or somewhere, wherever, you know, and and you come back and you see, wow, it's actually faded a bit. So yeah, that's a pity. And you can't see any of it as it disappeared completely. You can't go over it.
No, exactly. So it's not really the paper, it's the pen.
It's probably the pen, especially if it's on a frame and it's hanging up, because then and that's always my issue with people wanting to do something for their wall, and they're using these water-soluble pens. All of these, they're going to fade completely. So even in indirect light, they'll fade, because it's just the light. Yeah, so it doesn't mean that it was in direct sunlight. It could just be out in the light. But that's a pity.
Exposed,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great, pleasure. Any other questions? No, it's because I'm so amazing. I've told you everything. I think your brains have just shut down. Okay, guys, I'm going to put this on YouTube. So anything you want to go and have a look at, again, you can. I find this fascinating. If there's something you can't remember, as I said, I have all my little notes. The reason I'm not making those public is because I just pulled information from loads of different sites. I didn't credit anyone because they were my personal notes, so that's why I'm not sending them out. But if you do want to know anything specifically about, like Kathy, like your question, let me know, and I can always just send you that piece or tell you where to go and have a look. Okay. All right, guys. So I'm going to go and have coffee now to wake up after this.
Thank you so much.
Workshop. Pleasure.
Thanks, Robyn.
Absolute pleasure. And if
Thanks,
you need
it was
photos,
lovely.
Thanks so much, Robyn.
Pleasure. I've shown you guys a lot of pads and things. If you need to know where to get one, or you want a photo and something stuck in your mind after this, message me and I'll just take a pic for you and send it. Okay.
Cool.
All right,
Thank you.
guys.
Perfect.
Enjoy the
Thanks
rest
so
of your day.
much. Have a good
Brilliant.
weekend.
Have a good
Bye.
coffee. Bye.
See you later.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.